The noise in the restaurant was familiar, the soft clink of dishes, the quiet conversations, the smell of fresh bread and spices. But at one table in the corner, the atmosphere was different, tense. The waitress, a young white woman with a tight smile, stood with her arms crossed in front of a black customer. Her voice, though friendly, was laced with mockery. "Perhaps you could give me a simpler menu," she said, raising an eyebrow. "One that would definitely feed." The man looked at her, trying to remain calm. His manners were impeccable, but her behavior was becoming more and more openly rude. She leaned her elbows on the table, as if trying to dominate, and threw out another barb. "This is probably your first visit to a restaurant of this level. You are certainly used to fast food." Her loud laughter echoed around the room, attracting the gaze of other customers. Some exchanged quiet glances, but no one intervened. The man, without losing his dignity, adjusted the cuffs of his jacket and slowly looked up at the waitress. "I think you are mistaken," he said calmly, but his look expressed much more than his words. The waitress, feeling that her attempt to humiliate him had failed, tensed up, but instead of stopping, she decided to go further. "People here are used to a certain standard, you know," she said with a fake smile. "I hope you can handle it." Her words sounded like a final challenge. The man seemed to consider her remarks, his calm unwavering, but something in his eyes told her that she had just crossed a line into something greater than she could have imagined. The waitress returned to the table where the man was sitting. Her smile was still forced, but there was irritation in her eyes. "So, have you decided what you're going to order?" she asked, as if challenging him. Her tone was cold, and even the surface politeness seemed forced. The man looked at her calmly, then turned his gaze to the menu. "I would like to order a steak medium rare," he said, without unnecessary emotion, but with dignity. The waitress narrowed her eyes, as if his answer had caused her internal displeasure. "You know, our steaks aren't cheap here," she said mockingly, her voice a little louder than it needed to be. "How about something simpler? Or maybe I can help you choose something that's definitely within your budget." Several customers at nearby tables began to notice what was happening. The man, still maintaining his composure, put down his menu and looked up. "I think my choice will suit me," he said calmly. "And you?" The waitress took a step back but did not stop. "Well, if you're sure you can afford it," she said as she wrote down the order, her voice quiet but audible to the nearby tables. Instead of answering, the man took a deep breath and continued to look at her, not allowing the situation to get out of control. His calmness only irritated her more. "I'll be back in a minute," the waitress said, turning away, her steps quick and nervous. As she left, the man glanced at the other customers who were watching furtively. There was no anger or shame in his gaze, only firmness and confidence. Something about that moment told everyone watching that this was just the beginning, and that the outcome of this scene would be nothing like what the waitress had expected. When the waitress returned to the table, her manner became even more abrupt. She placed a glass of water on the table so that several drops spilled, but did not even apologize. "Your order has been passed on," she said dryly, almost throwing the words out. "I hope you understand that it is not customary to linger here unless you order dessert." The man didn't answer. His face remained calm, although his gaze became slightly more intense. He straightened up, folded his hands in front of him, and nodded briefly. "Thank you," he said, but his voice sounded so confident that the waitress involuntarily tensed. Her irritation grew. She was not satisfied with his calm, his manner, his immobility under her hints. She wanted to provoke him, but every time he maintained his composure, she felt her attempts lose their power. "You'd better hurry up with your dessert," she said, returning a few minutes later. "We don't just hold tables, especially at rush hour." The man looked up again, but this time his voice became firmer. "I'm not finished yet. If there are problems, I can talk to the manager." These words caught her off guard. She stopped, but quickly returned the forced smile to her face. No problem," she replied, but her tone suggested otherwise. "I just wanted to remind our guests of the rules." He said nothing, merely raising an eyebrow slightly, indicating that her words did not matter. The waitress walked away, her face flushed with a mixture of irritation and confusion. She felt that the situation was spinning out of her control. The other customers who had been watching the scene began to whisper. Some cast sympathetic glances at the man. Others looked disapprovingly at the waitress. The atmosphere in the room became noticeably tense. But the man remained firm. Every gesture, Every word showed that he had no intention of giving in to provocation. He understood that what was happening was a test, and he was ready to go through it to the end, maintaining his dignity. His calm was like a rock, against which the waves of rudeness crashed, and although the pressure was increasing, he knew that he was right, and those watching from their tables began to understand that there was more to this situation than just a dispute between a customer and a waitress. The waitress was losing control of the situation more and more. Her irritation was growing, but she could not understand why her barbs and hints were not producing the desired result. The customer remained calm, unperturbed, as if he knew something that was inaccessible to her. Her tension was becoming noticeable not only to him, but to other customers as well. She returned with a dish, but placed it on the table with such force that the plate almost moved to the edge. "Here's your order," she said, but her voice was rough, and even her first smile couldn't hide her mood. "I hope it meets your expectations." The man looked at her and nodded slowly. He thanked her without raising his voice, but there was a subtle hint in his gaze that things were not going as she expected. "Thank you," he said. "I think now we'll have a chance to discuss the level of service." Her face frowned. For the first time, she felt the situation turning. Several people at nearby tables, who had been watching intently, began to whisper. The waitress noticed the customers' gazes shifting from her to the man, and felt her confidence slip. She quickly turned around and headed to the counter where the manager was standing. He had already noticed the unusual tension in the room. When the waitress approached, her voice was agitated. "This client is acting strange," she began, avoiding direct eye contact. "Maybe you could talk to him?" The manager frowned, his gaze moving to the customer who was sitting at his table, quietly eating his dinner. He didn't seem bothered by what was going on. "What exactly did he do?" the manager asked, not taking his eyes off the man. The waitress hesitated, her words sounding less and less convincing. "It's just, he seems too picky, and the other guests notice it." She tried to justify herself. The manager sighed. He wasn't used to acting on vague complaints. His instincts told him that things weren't that simple. He decided to approach the table in person. When he stopped at the customers, his polite voice eased the tension. "Good evening. I am the manager of this restaurant. Is everything okay?" The man looked up, his face calm, but there was a subtle edge to his voice. "Thank you. Everything is fine, although your staff seems to need additional training in service standards." The words were loud and confident, attracting the attention of the entire room. The manager noticed some of the customers nodding in agreement. He sensed that there was more to this conflict beneath the surface, and now attention turned to the waitress. She stood at the counter, trying to look unconcerned, but her face was flushed. "We'll definitely look into it," the manager replied, bowing slightly. "Thank you for your feedback." The man nodded silently and returned to his dinner. However, the manager realized that this was not the end. He had to find out what exactly had happened at this table and fix what could ruin the reputation of their establishment. The waitress felt the ground under her feet become shaky. She realized that her actions were now under the close attention of not only the manager, but everyone in this room. The waitress returned to the table, trying to look confident, but her tense tone betrayed her inner tension. She placed the bill on the table, even though the customer had not even finished his meal. "You might want to pay in advance," she said, smiling slightly, "in case you have difficulties." The man looked up, remaining calm. There was no anger in his face, only restraint and steadfastness. He picked up the bill, looked at it, and then carefully placed it back on the table. "I will finish my meal before considering payment," he said with the same level-headed firmness that had repeatedly thrown the waitress off balance. Her face twitched slightly, and she stood there for a few seconds, as if considering what to say next. Her confidence was visibly shaken, but she couldn't let it show. She glanced at the manager, who was watching from a distance, and then leaned closer to the customer, trying to speak so that no one would hear. "You know, people like you really find themselves in places like this," she said in a whisper, but her voice was sharp. "It must be unusual for you, right?" The man looked at her calmly, and then said just as quietly, but firmly, "People like me. Are you sure you know who you're dealing with?" The words sounded like a challenge. The waitress recoiled, her face palling slightly. She didn't know how to react to his calm confidence, which seemed to shatter every attempt she made to humiliate him. Meanwhile, The conversation between them began to attract the attention of other customers. Some looked at them openly, others exchanged wary glances. The manager noticed the growing tension and headed towards the table. "What's going on here?" he asked, stopping next to the waitress. His voice was polite, but there was a sternness to it. The waitress, trying to maintain the appearance of control, replied, "Everything is fine. We were just discussing the details of the order." The man looked at the manager, his gaze direct. "I think you need to rethink the way your staff approaches customer service," he said, "especially those who don't seem to fit their mold." The words were spoken quietly, but there was power in them. The manager realized that the situation required his intervention. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said. "I will personally ensure that your visit is completed on a proper level." The waitress frowned, her face flushed with shame. It became clear to her that the situation was getting out of her control. She tried to object, but the manager stopped her with a look. "Please rest in the staff lounge," he said sternly. She wanted to object, but realized that any word she said could make the situation worse. Taking a step back, she moved away from the table, feeling the gaze of the other guests on her. The man looked at the manager and, for the first time that evening, allowed himself a slight smile. "Thank you. I think you know what to do next," he said, returning to his dinner. The atmosphere in the hall began to lighten, but the aftertaste of what had happened remained. Everyone understood that this story was not over yet, and its outcome would be a lesson for everyone who saw how patience can turn into strength and disrespect into destruction. As the waitress walked into the staff room, her steps were quick but unsteady. She couldn't understand how the situation had gotten so out of control. She always felt confident in her words, believed that she could easily control any customer. But this man had thrown her off balance. Something about his behavior, his voice and his demeanor made her feel vaguely uneasy. In the small staff room, she closed the door behind her and finally allowed herself to exhale. But even here, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her colleague, another waitress, looked up curiously. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, noticing the nervousness in her movements. "Nothing," the waitress replied sharply, avoiding his gaze. "Some customer is just being overly dramatic." "That man at the corner table," the colleague asked, "are you sure he's just a customer?" The question made her freeze. She looked at her colleague, but she only shrugged. "He's just a weird guy," the other waitress continued. "He looks way too confident for a regular customer. Did you notice how the manager immediately switched to him?" The waitress tensed even more. Her irritation had been growing, but now fear was added to it. She remembered how the manager had almost immediately taken the customer's side, as if he knew something she didn't. Thoughts began to enter her mind that she had tried to push away. Who was this man? Why did his words carry such weight? At this time, the manager continued to watch the client in the hall. His attention was drawn to the man's behavior, calm but confident. This did not look like a casual visitor who could be easily impressed. He came closer to make sure the client was not uncomfortable. "Is everything okay?" the manager asked, noticing that the man had finished his meal. "Everything is fine," the man replied, smiling slightly. "However, I think we should discuss your service standards." The words were spoken so calmly that the manager felt a slight chill. There was a hidden firmness in the man's voice that made him think. He sat her down at the table opposite and nodded. "Of course, I'm ready to listen to your comments," the manager said. "We're always open to feedback." The man folded his arms and looked at him with a slight smile. "Feedback is great," he began, "but I prefer to address these issues in a more formal setting." The manager frowned, but did not interrupt. The man continued, "I own several such establishments, and I always pay special attention to how the employees communicate with clients." These words sounded like a bolt from the blue. The manager frowned, but tried to remain calm. "Are you the owner?" he asked cautiously, not hiding his surprise. "You could say that," the man replied, his voice remaining level. "I invest in restaurants that believe the respect for the customer is not just a rule, but the foundation of their work." The manager felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He realized that this customer was not just a casual visitor. The man's words sounded like a warning, and now the manager knew that the consequences of this visit could extend far beyond the restaurant. Meanwhile, in the staff room, a waitress noticed a text message from one of her coworkers on her phone. "You better go out. Looks like it's not just a customer." Her fingers trembled as she opened the message, but before she could read it, the door to the room swung open. The manager was standing in the doorway, his face serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice stern. "Right now." The waitress stood up, but inside she was shaking. She didn't know what was waiting for her behind the door, but she already felt that everything was not going as she had planned. The waitress walked slowly out of the staff room, feeling as if every move she made was accompanied by a heavy gaze from invisible eyes. Her heart was beating faster than she could allow. The room had become unusually quiet, as if even the usual hum of conversation had suddenly ceased. All attention was focused on the corner table where the man was sitting, now with the manager at his side. She took a step forward, but her legs felt like lead. The manager motioned her to the table, and she felt a cold sweat run down her back. There was something elusive in the room, a tension that didn't go away, but only grew. "Please come forward," the manager said in a level but firm voice. "Our guest has a few questions." The man sitting at the table did not look up as she approached. Only when she was next to him did he turn his gaze to her. His eyes were calm, but there was something incredibly sharp in that calm. Like a knife blade, she felt that her words and actions no longer had any power. Everything she had done before now hung over her like a huge shadow. "Tell me," he began, his voice low but every sound echoing in the room. "Is this how you always treat your clients? Or have I done something to deserve your special attention?" Her breathing became shallow. She tried to say something, but the words got stuck in her throat. I was just trying to maintain service standards," she said, her voice weak. "Standards?" the man asked, his gaze sharpening. "Is humiliating a client part of your standards?" The manager gave her a look of disappointment. He knew that this was not just a random conflict, but something more that could seriously affect the reputation of the establishment. The waitress felt like her legs were barely holding her up. "I may have been a little harsh," she began, but the man interrupted her, his voice calm but with a sense of power. "Cutting," he repeated. "You allowed yourself to judge a man based solely on your own preconceived notions, and now you're trying to justify it." His words were like blows, each one forcing her eyes lower. She knew that excuses would not help, but she continued to search for words. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," she muttered. "Offend?" The man leaned back in his chair. "Your actions are more than an offense. This is a problem that goes beyond this restaurant." At that moment, there was complete silence in the room. Every eye was glued to what was happening. Some patrons looked at the man with sympathy. Others looked at the waitress with condemnation. She felt that she could not bear the tension any longer. The man turned to the manager. "I'm not asking anyone to lose their job," he said, "but I am asking that your establishment review its approach to staff training." The manager nodded, realizing that the situation required immediate action. The waitress wanted to say something, but instead she simply took a step back, feeling her world crumble. When she returned to the staff room, her heart was heavy. She knew this story was just beginning, but now her role in it had changed. No longer was she seen as the confident professional. Now she was a lesson, an example of how one mistake could change everything. When the waitress returned to the staff room, the tension in her shoulders was still there. She mindlessly flipped through the pages of her order pad, trying to distract herself from what had happened in the dining room, but she couldn't suppress the feeling that something had changed irreversibly. She noticed that her colleagues were stealing glances at her, and their gazes were more wary than before. Meanwhile, the atmosphere in the room continued to change. The manager, standing at the man's table, was tensely considering his next move. He understood that what had happened had not only left an unpleasant aftertaste for the client, but had also become a topic of discussion among other visitors. Some had already begun sharing their impressions on social media, taking photos of the table with the man and the manager, although no one was doing so openly. The man sitting at the desk remained calm. His confidence and dignity made the manager feel that there was more to the situation than met the eye. When the man spoke again, his voice was quiet, but his words were clear. "Do you understand that this behavior of your staff is not just a mistake? It is a reflection of your system." The manager tensed slightly, but nodded. "We will do everything we can to correct this situation," he replied. "Our customers deserve better." The man looked at him carefully, as if assessing the sincerity of his words. "I hope you understand that this is not just about your restaurant," the man said. "This is about respect, which should be the basis of any interaction." The manager nodded again, but this time with more seriousness. He felt that these words were addressed not only to him, but to everyone who was observing this situation. He decided to act. The manager went to the nearest table where the customers were sitting and addressed them. "We apologize for what happened. This does not meet our service standards. If you notice anything that bothers you, please let us know." The gesture was noticeable to all. Many of the customers nodded, showing respect for the attempt to correct the situation, but some still cast worried glances, indicating that trust in the establishment would take a long time to restore. Meanwhile, the waitress sat her day in the staff room, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. She knew her actions would not go unnoticed. The manager called her over for a chat. Her heart began to pound, but she forced herself to stand up. "Do you understand that your work today has undermined our reputation?" the manager began, his voice stern. "And this concerns not only the client, but also everyone who witnessed it." The waitress nodded, trying not to meet his gaze. Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. "I didn't think it would go this far." "That's the point," the manager interrupted. "You haven't thought. It's your responsibility to show respect to everyone who comes into our restaurant." This conversation, although it took place in a closed room, felt like the final blow to her self-confidence. She realized that her mistakes had not only hurt the client, but also undermined her professional reputation. Meanwhile, the man left the restaurant, leaving his business card with the manager. His words and actions left a deep mark. The moment the door closed behind him, everyone felt that this visit had become an important lesson not only for the waitress, but for the entire establishment. The waitress stood at the counter, staring at one point, as if trying to concentrate on something to calm her thoughts. Her hands were shaking, and hundreds of assumptions were racing through her head. She was trying to figure out who the man was, why he was so calm despite her behavior, and why the manager looked so tense after their conversation. Her intuition told her that the situation was far from as simple as it seemed at first glance. At that moment, the manager came back into the room, his face grim but determined. He was holding something in his hand, a small business card that the customer had left behind before leaving. The waitress saw the manager read the text on the card several times, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. Then he raised his head and looked straight at her. His gaze was heavy, and this made the waitress feel even worse. "Do you know who this client was?" he asked, coming closer. She hesitated, feeling her insides tighten. Her voice was strained, almost a whisper. "Just a regular customer," she said, trying to maintain the remnants of her confidence. "Regular?" the manager asked, his voice growing harsher. He tossed the card onto the counter in front of her. "Read it." Her eyes widened as she read the text on the card. It read, "Jonathan Raines, owner, Luckstein Group," a name that everyone on the staff knew, but she had never seen his face. Her breathing quickened, and she felt her legs begin to buckle. This was her boss. No, more than that. This was the owner of the entire establishment where she worked. She began, but the words got stuck in her throat. "Yes," the manager said, cutting her off. "He's the guy who pays your salary, and you just humiliated him in front of all the customers." The words came as a bolt from the blue. She took a step back, feeling the world around her crumble. Her entire confident facade that she had been putting up all this time was gone. Her face was flushed with shame, but what scared her most was that her actions could affect not only her own reputation, but the reputation of the restaurant as well. I didn't know," she muttered, trying to justify herself. "That's no excuse," the manager snapped. "Your job is to treat everyone who comes into this restaurant with respect, no matter who they are. And now, because of your behavior, our reputation could suffer." The waitress looked at the card again, as if hoping that what she had read would change. But it didn't. She tried to think of a way to explain her actions, but nothing came to mind. She was overcome with despair. Meanwhile, something strange started happening at the restaurant. Customers who witnessed the scene with Jonathan Raines started sharing it on social media. Several posts with photos and short videos have already garnered hundreds of comments. Most people expressed support for the man and condemnation of the waitress' actions. Someone even mentioned that they had seen him before at events for restaurant owners, confirming his status. The manager knew he had to act fast to save the situation. He gathered the staff for a short meeting, told them what had happened, and demanded the utmost professionalism from everyone. The waitress sat her in the corner, barely listening, Her thoughts were focused on how she could have made such a mistake, how she had failed to notice the obvious. Later that evening, the manager received a text from Jonathan Rains. It was short but powerful. "We'll talk tomorrow. Expect a personnel report." Those words made him feel like tomorrow would be a big test not just for him, but for the entire team. Meanwhile, the waitress realized that she would not be able to escape the consequences. She spent the rest of the evening thinking about what she would say if Jonathan returned. But deep down, she knew that her behavior was indefensible and the consequences would be inevitable. Night had fallen on the city, but in the waitress' head, everything was as vivid as if every moment of the day was replaying itself. She sat on the edge of the bed in her tiny apartment, feeling the air become heavy and viscous. It seemed as if the walls of the room were slowly closing in, narrowing her space, depriving her of the opportunity to breathe. Thoughts, one more terrible than the other, did not give her peace. What happens next? She asked herself over and over, but she couldn't find the answers. Her fingers trembled as she tried to text her manager, but each time the words seemed useless. She knew she couldn't justify herself. Before her eyes was the business card of Jonathan Rains, her boss, her judge. She remembered his gaze, calm, but so cold that it burned into her from the inside. The fear was starting to build. The waitress knew that the confidence she had projected throughout her shift had vanished like sand washed away by a wave. Now she felt that her actions were not just a mistake, they were a blow to her career, to her future, to everything she had worked so hard to build. She tried to calm herself, but all she could see in her mind were the comments of customers, the looks of her colleagues, and Jonathan's implacable judgment. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the stares of her colleagues. But even in the empty room, she could not feel relief. Every chair, every plate reminded her of her mistakes. She heard the staff whispering somewhere behind the counter, their voices muffled, but the words seemed to hit her right in the heart. She knew they were discussing her. The manager walked into the room with a serious look. His footsteps were loud, echoing in the empty room. He approached her, holding a tablet in his hand. "Do you understand what will happen next?" he asked without any preamble. She looked up but quickly looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She began, but her voice broke. "I didn't know who it was." The manager chuckled, his face remaining stern. "And that should justify your behavior?" he asked, emphasizing each word. "You think that this attitude is acceptable if the client is not the owner?" Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them to her knees to hide it. She felt small, insignificant, as if all her confidence had vanished without a trace. "I was wrong," she whispered. "It won't happen again." "That's not enough," he interrupted. "You realize that he's not just a client, but a man who could put you out of business, put all of us out of business." The words rang louder than she expected. Her fear turned to panic. She knew the manager was right. This restaurant, his team, her co-workers, all of it could be at risk because of her actions. A few minutes later, Jonathan Rains walked into the room. His presence filled the space with unbearable tension. He walked up to the table, sat her down, and motioned for the manager and waitress. Her legs felt like cotton wool, but she forced herself to come over. "Sit down," he said quietly, but his voice was so firm that she thought it was in order. She sank into a chair, trying not to look him in the eye. He was silent for a few moments, and then, folding his hands on the table, he began to speak. "I didn't come to your restaurant to test anyone," he began, his voice even. "I wanted to enjoy the food and watch you work. Instead, I witnessed the person who should be the face of this place disgrace it." Her breathing quickened as she felt Jonathan's words pierce her armor, leaving her completely vulnerable. "Tell me, why do you think you can treat customers like that?" he asked, and there was no anger in his voice, but something more terrible, cold determination. She couldn't answer. She knew that any word she said would sound pathetic and unconvincing. She felt exposed, as if he had seen right through her. Jonathan continued, "Respect is not something you show when you are forced to. It is something that should be part of your job every day. And today you have proven that you have no place in this business." Her eyes filled with tears. She knew it was the end, but even in that moment, she knew she deserved everything that happened. The room where the meeting was taking place was suddenly too quiet. Even the ticking of the wall clock, which no one usually noticed, was now deafeningly loud. The waitress sat at the table across from Jonathan Rains and the manager, feeling like her whole world was collapsing. The air was thick, as if there was not enough of it to breathe. Every glance, every pause in conversation, increased her fear. Jonathan Rains continued to stare at her, his gaze icy but not malicious. That was worse. It was the gaze of a man who saw her not as a professional, but as an example of everything that was fundamentally wrong. The waitress knew that her actions had exposed not just her own weaknesses, but had jeopardized the reputation of the establishment she was a part of. You understand, he began, finally breaking the silence, that in any other situation, in any other restaurant, you would no longer be working here. Her lips trembled, but she found no words. She could neither justify nor explain her behavior. All her attempts would seem unconvincing in front of this man, who radiated confidence and strength. I'm far from demanding perfection from every employee, he continued, his voice even but with a steely edge. But what I saw here is not just a mistake, it's a problem that needs to be solved. The waitress felt her heart sink. She knew that this decision would probably not be in her favor. She realized that her confidence, her indifference, her unwillingness to show respect for others were now turning against her. The manager, who had been silent all this time, sighed heavily. I think Ms. Rains understands how serious the consequences are, he said to Jonathan, but his voice was uncertain. Jonathan nodded slightly, but his gaze remained fixed on the waitress. Does he understand? He asked, now addressing her directly. What do you have to say in your defense? Her voice was weak when she finally spoke. I didn't think it would go this far, she whispered. I made a mistake. A mistake, he repeated, leaning forward. A mistake is something that can be corrected, but your actions were deliberate. You allowed your biases to determine how you treated me, and the worst part is, you did it in front of other people. His words were as precise as a knife. She felt each phrase echoing pain in her chest. Tears began to fill her eyes, but she knew that tears would not help. I don't know how else to apologize, she said, her voice shaking. I know what I did was wrong. It won't happen again. You're right. It won't happen again, he said, because in this restaurant, such things don't happen. She frowned. The words sounded like a death sentence. Her heart was beating so hard, it felt like it was about to jump out of her chest. But I also believe, he continued after a pause, that people can change if you give them a chance. However, this chance must be earned. Her eyes widened. She didn't expect to hear something like that. It was like a lifeline in a sea of fear and despair. I'll give you time to prove that you can improve, he said, leaning back in his chair. But if I hear one more complaint about you, if I notice that you haven't learned from this situation, you'll lose this job, and you'll never be able to work in this field again. His words were both a warning and an opportunity. She nodded, unable to speak. This was her last chance. When the meeting ended and she was alone in the room, she was overcome with mixed feelings. There was fear for the future, shame for her actions, and a glimmer of hope. She knew she had a long way to go to prove she deserved this chance. But now she saw how easy it was to ruin your reputation if you let yourself forget the importance of respect. After her encounter with Jonathan Rains, the waitress returned to the dining room feeling as if the world had fallen on her shoulders. Every step echoed. Every glance from her colleagues seemed accusing. She tried to focus on her duties, but her hands were shaking, and every gesture betrayed her inner uncertainty. She felt like everyone around her knew what had happened and was judging her. The patrons seemed to notice her tension. Those who had been in the room during the incident with Jonathan looked at her longer than usual, their gazes full of curiosity and distrust. It seemed that everyone knew her story. Everyone was assessing her. It felt like a weight she could no longer bear. At one point, she stopped at the counter and felt her breath catch. She tried to pull herself together, but a voice inside her told her she couldn't handle it. She remembered Jonathan's words, "You can earn this chance." But how? How could she prove that she could change when her every move was now under scrutiny? Meanwhile, back at the office, the manager continued to discuss what had happened to Jonathan. They were studying customer reviews, social media posts, and came to the conclusion that the situation had received much more attention than they had expected. Several posts with the restaurant's hashtag had already gone viral, and people were actively sharing their opinions. Some expressed support for the man, while others condemned the waitress and her behavior. This was a serious blow to the restaurant, and the manager knew that it would not be easy to fix its reputation. Jonathan was calm, but his determination to act was evident in every word he spoke. "We can't ignore this," he told the manager. "This incident should be a lesson for everyone. We must not only correct the mistake, but also show that we are learning from it." The manager nodded in agreement, but there was a look of worry in his eyes. He knew the waitress was in the middle of a hurricane they couldn't control. The question now was whether she could live up to the second chance she'd been given. When the waitress returned to the kitchen, she heard her co-workers talking about her. They spoke quietly, but every word echoed in her head like thunder. She just didn't know who he was. One of her co-workers said, "Even if she had, it would still be unforgivable." Another replied. The waitress felt her face heat up. She wanted to disappear, to walk away from there and never come back, but she knew that would be too easy. She would have to go through with it if she wanted to regain any respect. The day went on, but it seemed endless. Every order, every request from a client felt like a test. She noticed that she had become more attentive, tried to be polite and helpful, but her smile seemed forced, her voice uncertain. She was afraid of making another mistake, afraid that someone would complain about her again, and then her dismissal would become inevitable. As the day drew to a close, she was the last one left in the room, clearing tables and tidying up. The room was quiet, except for the sound of a broom. Her thoughts kept returning to Jonathan. His words, his look, his calm, confident seal of it continued to weigh on her. She knew he wouldn't show up right away, but she knew he'd be watching. Through the manager, through customer feedback, through her every move. She finished cleaning and walked out of the restaurant. The night was cold, and the air burned her lungs. She looked up at the sky, and for the first time all day, a strange feeling came over her, not fear, but determination. She knew she had no choice but to change. This was her last chance, and she couldn't afford to lose it. But even with this determination, there was still anxiety in her heart. Could she cope? Could she prove to everyone that she was worthy of a second chance? Or would this incident be the beginning of the end of her career? The questions remained unanswered, but now she had to find them. The night after the meeting with the manager and the letter from Jonathan Rains, the waitress couldn't sleep. The words "last chance" swirled in her head like a warning. She knew that every action she took would now be judged, and any step away could be her last in the restaurant. Her isolation among her co-workers only heightened this feeling. They no longer looked at her as an equal in their eyes. She was a reminder of how easy it was to lose trust. The next day, she arrived at the restaurant an hour before opening. The empty space felt like both a safe haven and an arena, where she would prove her willingness to change. She picked up a rag and began wiping down the tables, then checked the service, prepared the trays, and put everything back in its place. The work calmed her, although she was still afraid inside. Soon the rest of the staff arrived. Her appearance, as always, was accompanied by silence and brief glances, but this time she decided not to look away. She approached one of her colleagues, who had been her friend at work in the past, and smiled reservedly. "Hello," the waitress said quietly. "If you need anything, let me know. I'm free." The colleague looked at her doubtfully, but then nodded. "Thank you. I have several large tables today," she replied, though her voice was cautious. This was the first step, small but important. Meanwhile, behind the scenes at the restaurant, Jonathan continued to monitor the situation. He was receiving reports on how the waitress was behaving, what the customers were saying, and how the team was reacting. He knew that change would take time, and he didn't expect immediate results, but he also knew that one event could change everything. And this event did not take long to happen. In the middle of that day, a large group of guests came into the restaurant, some of whom were already familiar to the manager and staff. These were regular customers who appreciated the restaurant for the quality of service and cuisine. The waitress, seeing how busy her colleagues were, decided to take the initiative and approach one of the tables. "Good afternoon," she said with a warm smile, trying to be as polite as possible. "Can I help you with your choice?" The guests, noticing her sincerity, nodded. They placed their orders, and the waitress did her best to ensure that the service was top-notch. She brought drinks on time, clarified the details of the order, made sure that the guests wanted for nothing. She did all this with a diligence that no one had noticed in her before. As the guests were leaving, one of them stopped at the counter and addressed the manager. "Excellent service," he said. "This girl really knows her stuff." The manager nodded stiffly, but inside he felt a slight sense of relief. He knew this was an important moment for her. However, For the waitress, this was only the first step. She knew there was still a long way to go. Her reputation was still in question, and her colleagues continued to treat her with caution. But she knew she had a chance, and she was going to fight for it to the end. Meanwhile, Jonathan Rains was preparing for his next move. He decided to come back to the restaurant, but this time not as a customer, but as an observer. He needed to see if the waitress had really changed, or if her efforts were just a mask to keep her job. When he entered the room, his appearance was not audible, but the waitress noticed him immediately. Her heart sank, but she pulled herself together. She knew this was her moment of truth. Could she show that she had learned her lesson, or would her efforts prove insufficient? Jonathan sat her down at a table in the corner, and the waitress slowly walked toward him. Her steps were firm, but inside she was seething. She knew that this day would be decisive in her career. The waitress watched Jonathan Rains take his seat. Her breathing quickened, but she knew there was no turning back. Each step she took toward his table echoed in her head, as if time had slowed. Her coworkers fell silent as he entered. Even the customers sensed something unusual in the atmosphere. Watching warily, she stopped in front of him, straightening up, trying to look confident, although inside everything was shaking. Her voice was even, but quiet. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" Jonathan looked up at her. His face was calm, but there was expectation in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of look that looked for mistakes, but the kind that assessed whether a person was capable of change. "I would like a cup of black coffee," he said calmly. "No sugar." Her hands shook as she wrote down her order, but she quickly composed herself and headed to the counter, feeling her co-workers' eyes burning into her back. They didn't say a word, but their silence spoke louder than words ever could. She felt completely isolated, like she was in a vacuum. A voice inside her was saying, "You have to do this. You have no choice." When she brought the coffee, her movements were careful, almost measured. She placed the cup on the table and leaned slightly. "If you need anything, let me know," she said, and without waiting for an answer, she took a step back. Jonathan slowly took the cup, tasted the coffee, then looked at her. "Tell me," he began, his voice quiet but strong, "do you understand why you found yourself in this situation?" Her throat was dry. She nodded, but she knew it wasn't enough. "Yes," she said, gathering her courage. "I let my emotions, my prejudices, get the better of me. It was wrong, and I realized that it not only hurt you, but it also put the reputation of the entire restaurant at risk." Jonathan looked at her, studying her every word. "And what are you going to do to fix this?" he asked. Her voice wavered, but she continued, "I'm going to prove that I can change. I'm going to work harder than ever. I'm going to show that I respect every client and every colleague. I know that trust must be earned, and I'm willing to do anything to regain that trust." The room was so quiet, you could hear the spoon clink against the sides of the cup. Jonathan kept his eyes on her, but there was a softness in his gaze now. "Okay," he said, putting his cup down. "But remember, words are only half the battle. The rest is your actions." She nodded, feeling her shoulders lighten a little, but instead of relief, she was overcome with the realization that every day would be a challenge from now on, and not just for her. Meanwhile, her colleagues began to talk about her behind her back. Some continued to judge her, while others, seeing her efforts, began to wonder if she could really change. Her isolation did not disappear, but there were glimmers of hope. The next day, Jonathan returned to the restaurant. This time, he was not alone. He was accompanied by representatives of the head office. They talked to the staff, reminding everyone of the importance of professionalism and equal treatment of all customers. For many, this was a surprise, but for the waitress, it was a chance not only to start over, but also to become an example for others. A few weeks passed. Her efforts began to bear fruit. Clients who had once seen her in a worse light began to notice her thoughtfulness and attention to detail. Co-workers who had been skeptical began to talk to her again. Her fear had not completely disappeared, but it had become her driver, reminding her how easy it was to lose everything. Jonathan watched her progress from afar. He knew that a second chance wasn't a gift, but an opportunity. And while he wasn't sure she'd be perfect, he could see that she was trying, and that was enough to keep her on the team. Justice had been served. She realized that trust was something that had to be earned every day, and although her journey had just begun, she had taken the first step toward becoming a better person. Thank you for watching this story to the end. We would like to know your opinion. What do you think about what happened? Have you ever experienced injustice or discrimination in your life? Share your stories in the comments. Every voice is incredibly important to us. We value each of you and are always happy to hear your revelations. Don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and click the bell to stay up to date with new stories that can inspire and make you think. We wish you a wonderful day and justice in every moment.